Couple. Excellent. How many people know of a place called Tabulum? Tabulum. Hands down. Tremendous. Now, we originally don't come from any of those areas, but I was born in Grafton. The family lived at one stage in Bayougal. My grandfather was born in Tabulum, but we actually come from a little place north of Tabulum, a place called Pretty Gully. Does anyone know Pretty Gully? Heard of Pretty Gully? Good. Well, not good really. But they're all important places in our home country. So from Grafton, the Clarence River, over the border into Queensland, some would even say it stretches through almost to Brisbane, to Woden and out to Stradbroke Island, because there are a lot of stories on Stradbroke Island which are pretty similar to the ones we have in northern New South Wales, until that imaginary new line that was drawn on the Queensland-New South Wales border. But you go to, how many people have heard of that state of, beautiful Queensland, perfect the next? Well, it's a load of rubbish, I can tell you that now. Because you get up here into Queensland and the little waves go plop, 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 plop along the ocean shore, and then you can't swim. But you get out to places like Byron Bay and Pottsville and so on, in my home country, Evans Head, and the waves come crashing in over the shorelines, and then you've got the great big rivers that run back up into the World Heritage Sites on the Queensland-New South Wales border. And of course one of those rivers is the Clarence, as part of my dreaming and about who I am as a person and so on. So you've got all the ocean shore and all those things that are associated, beautiful long golden beaches, beautiful magnificent river systems through there, and of course the rainforest at the other end. God's little garden of Eden is the north coast of New South Wales. Make sure you do go there and support the local area, because it does need your help. I have done plenty of things over my life, and of course one of the things is I now work for the Cardinal down in Sydney, and some of you may go, ooh, but it has been quite an interesting experience of working in Sydney from the point of view of the Cardinal has virtually said, I want you to try and enliven or try and bring some life back into the Aboriginal population back in Sydney. Now, it's not easy going, but at least we're going to try and attempt to do that. And we've already started. We've opened up a new mass centre in Sydney, but we want to go further. There are some 4,500 Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Catholics living in Sydney, but we don't touch many of them. The biggest area that we touch is we have about 900 or almost 1,000 students if you talk about the congregational schools in Sydney. So we have quite a lot of population of Aboriginals who are being educated in the system. And the Cardinal has made this edict that no child shall be denied an education in our system, which makes it very hard, because we've got to find the money to be able to support that. But there are a lot of kids who are coming, or students coming into our schools at the present time, to get a good education. And I'm a bit biased, and I think it's a very good education that they receive. But before I go any further, I'm a foreigner here, and it's important that we do stop and remember that we are on Aboriginal land. That there are people who've gone through in history, the forebearers of those who live here at the present time, who took the brunt of colonisation and had to deal with and live with the constant change. If you think about your own Western lifestyle, it took thousands of years to get where you are today, to be able to sit in this building. For us, from walking around in the bush, hunter collectors, just over 200 years. So our lifestyle has been dramatically changed overnight, and is still changing at this present time. And for them to be able to lead during that time has been quite an ordeal. So I'd like to spend just a moment to stop and remember those of the past, those traditional owners of the past who had to live with this. I need also to remember those of today who are still grappling with this continual change that's happening in their life. to remember those great leaders of today who are trying to lead their people in the right direction. And thirdly and lastly, just to take a moment to think about the students who you are teaching and all the other young people that we come in contact with. Over 2/3 of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population are under the age of 25. So we're dealing with a lot of young people. And hopefully that you and the great teachers and supporters of the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander population you have here, that you're able to instill in them a lot about their culture, as well as learning about this new Western system, so that they're able then to deal with in the future, and take up the roles which are their positions within the community in the future. I'd like to start by talking a bit about, for over 40, 60,000 years, my people have been here in this country. And we had a relationship and have a relationship with something that was bigger than ourselves. Something which you call God today. We call it Yirrambul, Wodgina, Miami, just some of the names. What's the local word? Do you have a local word? No, I can't think of one. We had ways of describing this thing that was so much bigger than ourselves. And we had ceremony based around how we related to this thing that was out there. But it's very hard to understand what God is. When you talk about God, you have all these sorts of visions about what God is. For us, the easy thing to try and learn about God was to use the symbols that were around all of us at that time. So in some cases, people spoke about God in the form of emu, or talked about God in the form of kangaroo, or talked about God as Bunjil, the great eagle who flew through the country. Or it could be the waves or something on the shoreline, the fish in the sea, the dolphin. It could be a whale that travelled through the country. Or it could be a mountain, and standing, like in my home country, looking at a mountain, a very sacred area. Trying to understand, or trying to get a glimpse of what this God was all about. And likewise in your own lives, you have those sorts of pictures of God. And it might take a moment just to think about, well, what are the images for you for God? For us, for instance, in our home country, like I said, there's a mountain. And when I'm standing on my side of that strange line, the New South Wales-Queensland border, and I look up there, I have a vision and a story about God as I view this. But on the other side of that imaginary line, just like most Queenslanders, when you look at this mountain from the other side, you have a totally different story and a different vision of what this God is all about. We have ceremony, as I've said before, dance and song that's brought to life a dreaming, not a dream time, as the early anthropologists and that started to use this word, because they saw it as something that was placed in the past. Dreaming is something that's alive today. It draws on the past. It's brought to life now and points us into the future. That's what dreaming is. So when we're talking about story and dance and ceremony, these stories we draw on from the past. For instance, Rainbow Spirit travelled through the country, it created things, and eventually went through and went to rest. These stories we draw on from the past, it enlivens in us today a reminder about the importance of God and God in our life, and of course points us into the direction that we should be living our life and gives us a direction. As I said, we had all sorts of visions of God. Here is one. Wodgina. Wodgina is a very important one. It's interesting about that painting, and that's a picture for the 2000 Olympics. What can you tell me about that painting? Or that depiction of God? out over everything. It was interesting, the talk in here yesterday about icons and about looking with and seeing. Both eyes have to be depicted with saints and so on. But there's something missing. What is it? Mouth. Because the law in Aboriginal culture has been put into place. The law of our relationships, our understanding about God was put in place at the beginning of time. We know about our relationships with one another. We have a whole system about who we can talk to, who we can't talk to, who we can marry, who we can't marry. Even to the point of view, if you go out hunting kangaroo, for instance, when you cut that kangaroo up, you get this bit, the softer bits go to the older ones who can't chew so well. There are laws of way of behaving with one another and relating to one another within our societies, right? Within our society. And even to the point of view that if you're a particular group, you dance in a particular fashion, and if you're a member of another group, you dance in a different way of trying to do things. But that is just a vision. The law is there, and that's the pointy bit, the lines on the top, usually done in red. Can't see whether it's in red, but the pointy bit on the top, which depicts the law. Law, and I always spell it L-A-W, I don't spell it L-O-R-E, because the Westerners like to think that law, L-O-R-E, is a fairy tale and something, but for us as Aboriginal people, the law is in place as law. That these are the ways that we are to relate and to interact with one another. A strange thing happened though. 2,000 or 4,000 years ago, some 4,000 years ago, a guy called Abraham started to romp around in the desert with his family. And the thing that really amazes me about this story and this fellow is this fellow was wandering around the desert also trying to get an understanding of this thing that was bigger than himself. God, or in his words, his language, Yahweh. With a beautiful word, Yahweh, breath, life, speaking. The thing that really amazes me about this, some thousands of kilometres away, with no seemingly contact with one another, we were thinking about this thing, whatever it was, out there, that was bigger than ourselves. With this thing out there, whatever it was. And depending on your own particular standpoint, you're able then to try and get a glimpse of that. Oh, you know, later as we learn, Jesus is the Lamb of God. This is a very good example because when the missionaries, of course, came out here into this country, they started to tell us about the Lamb of God. And of course we stood there and said, what's this lamb? We don't know what a lamb is. We've never seen a lamb before. This furry, woolly jumper that a place. We had no idea of this thing. But there are visions. Visions. Although they kept trying to instill in us that when we talk about God, God is the Lamb of God. Well, not for us. God wasn't. This fellow's amazing. Sometimes whenever we're dealing in Aboriginal culture, we tend to look towards the West. Because we look towards the West because it has all its beauty and colour and your 2,000 years of so-called tradition. And forget about our 40,000 years plus, 60,000 years of tradition that we have in our own backyard as Aboriginal people. Like I said, we knew about God. We didn't need you white fellas to come in and start telling us about this God. We knew about it. We interacted with it. We had story, we had ceremony based around this relationship. Yes, the coming of Jesus Christ was a new part of the story because it refined and made us think about how we need to refine our culture, about how it related to how we related to one another. For instance, in years gone by when we had old people in our communities, remember Aboriginal communities were small family groups who travelled through the country. So when people got to the age, a fair age where we could no longer really support them, or we'd have to carry them around the countryside, they decided, with our help, that we'd leave them behind and we'd go off and do things, and our family would survive out in this. But the older people would live by themselves and eventually die alone. Some of them may have died of starvation and everything. But we don't need to do that now. We don't need to do that anymore, because we can live and have that relationship still. We're no longer hunter-gatherers. We no longer have to travel through the country. So there's no need to leave those people behind. And likewise with relationships, about who we can relate to and who we can talk to. You'll go into some Aboriginal communities and you'll have a meeting and you'll find that half of the audience are all sitting with their back to another half of the audience because they're not allowed to relate. And there are reasons about that because of who we were as a people, about relating and not to get too close with people that we shouldn't get too close to. Just like you have in law, in Western law, we also have that in our own law. But the important thing from this slide is that we've got to remember that we have such a rich and beautiful culture that's right here in front of us, that we should be able to draw on. I often think back in the 90s of not the beginning of the whole environmental movement, but in my time of sitting around talking to groups about the environment and the importance of the environment, about sustainability. Not that I'm Bob Brown or anything like that, but that's something that Aboriginal people knew about how we live, that we don't use things to excess. That this is this time of year, we go out hunting and we only take this number of kangaroos because we know that we wait until the next time. Or in oysters, going out and plucking oysters at certain times of years, because we knew after 40,000, 60,000 years of their cycle of rebirth and so on within their life, and living in harmony with those things. Not just for the sake of being, it's wonderful and it's fantastic, but it was also part of our survival. We were hunter-gatherers, so we moved, right? Not nomadic as you know it, but we did move from place to place to place when the food was on. So we moved from place to place to place. We followed the cycles of life within our particular communities to get where we are. God's grace was with us. God's love was with us. We had everything that we needed. It was there. I'm hungry now. I can go to this bush here. I can pluck it off. It was provided for us. Those kangaroos who were sitting over there, I could go out there and hunt them. Well, some days I succeeded, some days I didn't. But they were there. I knew that they were there. They were provided for us. We had to do our part by watching the cycle and making sure that we did behave ourselves in the right ways that we behave in eating and so on. Of course, a lot of us were all touched by Christianity. There's not one Aboriginal group that has not been touched by Christianity. With the coming of the Westerners, the missionaries, they came out and they planted seeds, the seed about Christ within our lives. Some of it was forceful, some of it was quite dangerous, some of it was they were like terrorists coming into our communities, rounding us up, not to speak language, no longer to carry out ceremony as they knew it. This is the only way that we're able to carry out our life, is to go to Mass, celebrate the Eucharist. It was a way of thinking. That's me, just by and by, as my first communion. But like I said, all these groups have been touched by Christianity. We know about Christianity, we know about God, and we know about Christianity. Quite often, when the church and groups talk to us, they forget that at least a quarter of the population, over 70% of the Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander population are Christian, and at least 1/4 of the Aboriginal population, Aboriginal population is Catholic. And we're still dealt with, and people still talk to us as if we're still pagans. Because when the missionary arrived, the missionary not only brought Christ with him or her, or mainly him, but it also brought culture. And the two were put together. The culture and Christianity were one, when in actual fact it is not. Not the way the Western culture was brought here. And if you read, and which led to all these other things that took place, the whole mission movement, rounding up people, and missions were good things and bad things. You've got to understand that missions were good in the sense of, because outside these areas, Aboriginal people, especially in places like the Northern Territory, people were riding around on horseback, and I think here even in Northern Queensland, people were riding around on horseback and shooting Aboriginals as game, chasing them through the bush and so on. And in the case of the Northern Territory, they'd go through and then cut the heads off of the Aboriginals and ride around on horseback and use them as polo balls to entertain themselves and so on. So it was pretty dangerous outside. So bringing them into the mission, at least it was a little haven of safety. But they're in that area, tying religion and culture together, Western culture and religion together. We've got the idea of, well, you can no longer speak your language, you have to learn English, you can no longer carry out your ceremony and have a relationship with God the way you used to, although they didn't see it that way. They thought we were praying off to a pagan and some other god out there, but that wasn't true. We understood this thing that was bigger than ourselves. Some were called to come forward, and this fellow, of course, is Boniface Purgett. He's from Port Keats or Wadair in the Northern Territory. He was the first Australian permanent deacon, married permanent deacon within Australia. The first Australian, not just Aboriginal, the first Australian. So after Vatican II, Boniface came online. And Boniface found it good that he was in his own position. He is a lawman within his own culture and his own tradition. So outside of being a cleric, he'd go off to the bush and lead Aboriginal ceremonies as well. But within the church, of course, even Boniface, and I've been in Port Keats on many occasions, or whatever, and on one particular occasion I remember sitting in the congregation, and the priest who was the parish priest had Boniface, which was good, up front, leading the ceremony, not leading, but being part of the ceremony up the front, and Boniface would preach. And of course he'd preach in language. The parish priest didn't know the language, didn't understand. So about halfway through his homily, the parish priest would stand up and say to him, "That's enough now, Bonnie. Sit down now. We've had enough now. Let's get on and do all the proper things that are going on." We celebrated the Eucharist. So there's been a whole lack of understanding about our place within church. Yes, it's good to have us up for show, like in the Olympics and so on, to get us out and we can dance and we can dress up like, before colonisation and wear paint and things like that. But these fellows are leaders. Guys like Boniface are leaders. They have 60,000 years of knowledge that's been handed down from generation to generation to generation. A very prominent, important lawman within his own country. But does he get the respect? He's now retired. And of course next year is his 40th anniversary of his ordination as a permanent deacon and cleric within the church. And that's pictures in St Paul's outside the wall for the Mary MacKillop show that we I'm going to show you about 7 slides now, and I want you just to tell me, think about what's strange about these photos. That's the first one. That's at Mount Carmel in the Holy Land. That's at our church at Landaroos in Sydney, Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Sunday. That's Anthony, of course, and I'm not quite sure where I got that one from, but it looks like it must be Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Sunday somewhere. A healing prayer service in Western Australia. My boss. Another Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander Sunday. And recently I've started a new Aboriginal Catholic ministry in the Broken Bay Diocese, and this priest helped us celebrate it as well. All right. Tell me something about these photos. Good. It's pretty obvious, there's no Aboriginal leadership. Priests. There is Aboriginal leadership, but there are none who are priests. As Catholics, we should know that the biggest celebration for us as a church is the celebration of the Eucharist. And yet, in all these photos, and I could drag out thousands upon thousands of others, we do not have any leadership. But, if I go back to Boniface is a lawman. He can take you through ceremony. He can make you from a boy into a man. And there are women out there who can take you from a girl into womanhood in law. Very powerful people. Very knowledgeable people. But the Western Church does not recognise this leadership. I find it very, very frustrating in the 30 or so years working within the church that we do not have any Aboriginal leadership. In fact, I would go to say that the church, the Aboriginal Catholic Church, the Catholic Church will never ever be belonging to Aborigines until we do get that leadership. It'll always be the white fellas. We've always got to wait. The white fellas or the people from Africa, all these other people will have to come in to celebrate. We've got to wait for them to come and do this very special ceremony for us. We will never own it in that sense. It's always them and us. Yes, there are trappings. We have ditch players. We have vestments. A few decorations and things. All these little trappings around the outside. Good for show. But again, leadership is not there. And it's not for want of trying. Not for want of trying. For here in this diocese, for instance, you've got a great fellow up there at Mount Isa, Peter Smith. How many people know Peter? Hands down. If I was a bishop, he'd be ordained by now. In fact, some would say that he already does organise celebration of the Eucharist. They meet, they sit, they break bread, they talk together and break open the word up there at Mount Isa. He's a great man, but again, the church doesn't follow that. The Anglicans, of course, are a different story. Anglicans have done quite a lot in this area. This is Arthur Malcolm. He's the former Aboriginal Anglican bishop for Australia. The next fellow, of course, is Jim Lethwich. He's just retired not long ago. Again, the Anglican bishop, Aboriginal bishop. I can't remember her name. Nooka, this woman who is ordained as an Aboriginal priest in Nooka. And of course, Saivo Mabo, a good friend of ours, from the Torres Strait, who's the Torres Strait Islander bishop. Two things. It's all right just to ordain someone to the priesthood, which is great, and I think that's very important. But the next step also is that you also need to have bishops in the system that we run at the present time. Bishops that we run at the present time. Because they're the ones who can ordain the next line of people. The Anglican priesthood, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander priesthood, is going up and up and up and up. Now, you worry in the Catholic Church that you haven't got priests, but in the Anglican Church, Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander priests are going up and up and up in numbers. Why? Because there's a black face here. This is my church. I belong in this Christian church. There is a black face who's up there who's leading it. An Aboriginal face that's up there that's leading it for us as Aboriginal people. I did throw in, and this is where I go out on a limb, I did throw in that photo because women in our culture, women are very special. They also have ceremony. They have very special ceremony and lead in ceremony. They can bring young girls into womanhood. So within our tradition, leaders of ceremony can be women. I don't see it as a problem in our tradition. It's not me a problem. There have been experiments, of course, in the 1840s, right? Remember 1843, I think it was the first Catholic mission in Australia on Stradbroke Island. But about 1846, I think it is, 1846 from New Norcia in Western Australia, Salvato, who was the abbot, or eventually went on to be the bishop, thought, well, why don't we get some Aboriginals? Let's train them into leadership positions, and then we'll bring them back to minister to all the people. And of course, the Good Sisters, the Mercies, I think, were doing the same thing over there in Western Australia, who were taking young Aboriginal women, training them and wanting to come back and to lead the communities and so on. Slight problem, of course. The guy on the left, Demira, I think it's pronounced, well, first thing, both of them, both these fellows were taken out of New Norcia, taken over to Europe. They landed in Swansea, in southwest of the UK. They travelled to Ireland, and they travelled through London into France, Paris and Avignon, and then eventually ended up in Italy, and just south of Italy, just south of Naples, in a Benedictine monastery called Carmel, because Salvator was a Benedictine, as part of their training, right? They walked out of the bush 1 year, and the next minute they're over in Europe. What an experience that was. And even in the boat ride, if you read the journals and read the story of these fellows, they left from a boat from Fremantle, they travelled via South Africa around the Cape Good Hope, isn't it, that way? South Africa, and then back up into England. And then the shock, well, first of all Africa, but then the shock of England, Swansea, the big mining was going on at that present time. The amount of people, all these white people, and of course into Ireland and then eventually down in. And of course both of them got ill. Demiri, the guy on the left, of course, your left, was the first one to get sick because it was cold. It was totally foreign, not too many trees and so on, like in Western Australia at the present time. But the guy on the left got better, slightly, and the guy on the right, of course, eventually died over there. And he's buried in St. Paul's, outside the walls in Rome, and in an unmarked grave. But it's that little spot there where those bushes are, is where we think that he's actually buried under all that marble. And that door, of course, is the papal door, papal vestry door. So the Pope arrives there twice a year and has been doing it since 1846, 6 or whatever it is, whenever they arrived and he was buried there, come through the side gate next to this woman on the left with the red, over that grave, in through those doors to vest for Mass there in the cathedral. And it's been going on for over 200 years. But meanwhile, there is a Benedictine monk who was Aboriginal, who was buried right there in this place. And the great thing about the Mary MacKillop show in Rome, besides, yes, she was made a saint and a great woman and all that sort of stuff, was having two things. One was having a Mass in this very sacred place for Aborigines, because there's one of our own who is buried there. And the second thing was we were able to identify where we think he's buried at this present time. So you're talking about Aboriginals in the church. We have a connection with church. We have a connection with the Catholic Church here, even in Rome itself. And of course then Rome, while we're over there, opened up its archives and in the museum. So they had a big celebration of all the Indigenous arts, not just Australia, but there was Indigenous arts over there. So if you go to the #1 gallery, I think it is, in the Vatican Museum at the present time, there's a lot of old Aboriginal artefacts, art, religious art, inside the Vatican there in its #1 gallery at the present time. And some of them are very important. There are a couple of items in there which are very sacred and very important. I should go back to these fellas. It was a great idea that these fellas, to train our people to come back and lead our people. But the problem was, anyone guess what the big problem was? Yeah?
They weren't natural leaders.
No, I wouldn't say that. No, well, they probably weren't. Like, he was only 15 or 16 when he died, and the younger fellow would have been about 14, if that. I think that one of the problems was we had to remove them from their own rich culture and take them to somewhere that was very foreign to them to instruct them about God. I think that was that God was here, and surely there were enough learned in amongst all those Benedictines to be able to instruct these people about God. The second fellow, I should say, was well enough, and he got back to Australia. But if again you read in the journals, he was a Benedictine monk. Both of those received their habits from the Pope, Pope Pius IX, wasn't it? Pius IX. But when they got back, that fella on your left, Demira, didn't spend a lot of time back with the monks. He spent his last days, or last couple of years, back in the community, back with his own people. Because this world was so foreign from him. He would have been a bit more instructed in law, for instance, than the younger fellow. So therefore he had a lot more connection with culture. So while he was in Rome, you can read that in between the lines, that he was a bit more dissatisfied with what was taking place. Where the young fella just lapped it up, because he didn't know a lot about his own culture back at home. Of course, a guy like Pat, and I'm not speaking out of school, you can read it in his book, On the Long Road, I think it's called. But Pat's problems with the church. Pat went off to become a priest, an MSc priest, and that was great. And the church and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander community rejoiced in this, that one of our own were finally going to lead us in the ceremony. But like all of us, it's all good and lovely and fluffy in those early days, but then you find the realities. O'Loughlin, who was the Bishop of Darwin at that time, was a racist. I've got no question about that. Pat was trying to bring about change and trying to include Aboriginal people and trying to include culture within the celebration of the liturgy and so on, but he ran into problems with his bishop, O'Loughlin. And you can read the accounts even in the newspapers and so on. And also there are other problems that took place too, like we all have, which I'll talk a bit about in a minute. But eventually Pat gave up in the end too. There are other reasons too, but Pat gave up in the end. Like most of us. I've only got 5 minutes. We're going to better run on. All these popes have all spoken to Aboriginal people. That's me again on your left. Have all spoken to Aboriginal, encouraging us to try and take up this role within the church. Especially John Paul II in his great talk in Alice Springs. You can look it up. Hopefully this fellow will also lead the charge again as well with us. The ambassador, not the ambassador, the government's representative, Sir William Dean was over there representing us over at his installation, and he said, would you come to Australia? And of course he said, yes, I'd love to come. Hopefully he does come to Australia, because we need this. We need, again, more encouragement. Symbols, front page of the Australian in the 90s. Big argument between me and another person. Front page, headlines read, Aborigines call Jesus a turkey. Matthew Gill, an artist, depicted the Stations of the Cross, but Jesus, of course, was a turkey. That was the symbol for God, and he depicted it up there. But the rest of Australia didn't see it that way. They just wanted to do that. Quite often we get a lot of people who come in and want to help us and want to lead us there, but I think this statement is very important. Marlene Watson, Leila Watson wrote it. But the word there about liberation is very important. Liberation. About freedom and allowing us to develop, our life. All other parts of the world, the Apostle James and Paul and all these fellows went out into the world, dropped a seed, and it grew. It grew. The Orthodox tradition grew out of that. Right? Grew out of that. Here in Australia, we dropped a seed, but then we contained it. We put it inside a pot. And we kept it that way. And we still keep it that way today. But now the pot wants to break. It wants to put its roots back into the soil. So here's another analogy. Rainbow Spirit Theology, a good book to read. Drawing our culture, using our culture, drawing information from the West, the sheep, right? Allowing the Christ to pour over that information, the coming, the kookaburra, the morning glory, and leading us off into the future. It's a good system, a way of thinking about theology for ourselves. Drawing on our rich heritage, supplementing it with some information, because not all of it is good that comes from the West, into this, allowing Christ to pour over it, mill through it, so that we can get a direction from the future. Rainbow Spirit Theology, all good bookshops have it. But there are a lot of blockages, and a lot of it is ignorance. Ignorance by people such as yourselves in the pews, but also within the hierarchy of the church. One of the problems of enculturation, is the word they keep using it, is that we come up with ideas, but then we have to go along to the bishops. Would you mind if we do this? And the bishops say, oh, no, I don't think that's right, and so on. But what would he know about our culture? He wouldn't know anything about our culture. Oh, yes, I had one bishop tell me, oh, yes, I'm an anthropologist, I've studied you. But you don't know because you aren't Aboriginal. You don't live the life that we live. And that's one of the problems of enculturation. And it's not a dialogue. We're not having a dialogue. I'm speaking, you're just saying yes or no, in that sense. We need a good dialogue on this. But really, you've got to let my people go that they may worship me. And also it has ramifications for Australia. We're all searching. What is it to be Catholic, Christian in the Australian context? How does the seed that was planted here grow? There used to be, here in Queensland, of course, a vicariate for Aborigines. Do you know that? But it was in the early days of the church. The church was trying to set itself up, and therefore it forgot about a lot of the Aborigines and started to push towards all the people who could maybe help them out financially, and eventually ended up to be the Diocese of Cairns. But the idea in the early days, of course, the Vatican was writing, you need to do more about work with Aborigines. the church, and you can understand in those early days it was hard going, but it turned its attention elsewhere so it could set itself up instead of working towards setting up and working with the Indigenous people of this country. Is that time to say? All right. Does anyone have any questions of me? Don't be shy. I've heard worse. Yes?
Yeah, the question I'll ask is, has any Aborigine come forward, like a village seminarian, not so far in the Catholic domain?
Oh yeah, one from here, because Monty Pryor was a deacon, permanent deacon from here. Oh, it is Monty too.
That's it.
Yeah, that's Monty there. He's a permanent deacon too, passed away not long ago. But I was thinking, well, this fellow here, he was a priest. He was an ordained Catholic priest. Oh, well, still he is. Of course, he's left. But he is. Once a priest, always a priest.
Are you doing something to help them to go take that vocation?
Good, I'm glad you say that. One of our biggest problems here in Australia, over 200 years of experience of working with the church, is our problem with celibacy. It does not work within our community. It does not work within our community. And you can understand that from our point of view of that life, it was about life. So we were married, our lawmen were married, and it was procreation to sustain the future. So our tradition tells us that celibacy, I'm not saying that, I lived 20 years as a religious brother with celibate lifestyle, and I can tell you now, it has something to offer to the world. If you think about all the great thinkers that came out of Europe, all those monastics who sat around and prayed and so on, there were a lot of great thinking that took place in that time. But I would say it should be optional. And in our case, it could be like, who's to say that tomorrow morning that someone's going to be born within an Aboriginal community who will go off to become a celibate priest? I don't know that. But I can't wait for that to happen. Because meanwhile, our people are getting more, they're not getting less and less interested in church. And there's going to be more and more when you've only got white fellas up the front. Over here.
Bishop Chris Saunders, he's
Yes.
tried to get Aboriginal fellows to be deacons. He's offered to discount or modify their academic part of the formation process, but still has been unable to get guys to enter candidacy. Got any thoughts on that?
Well, it's a hard work. I mean, I've worked 30 years in this area, and I tell you that I started with black hair. Now look at me. And I worked for the Bishops' Conference at one stage. It is hard going. You're bashing your head against the wall because there are people out there who just do not understand, who are ignorant of us as Aborigines. And it's a power thing in that sense too. One has to say that this is ours, and we're not going to let it go. But you've got to let it go so that it will grow. Yeah. Like I said, there are Aboriginal people, die-hard Aboriginal Torres Strait Islander people here in this country who are there. Some of them even go to mass every day. Some of the Torres Strait Islander groups and so on, they're there every day lining up because they see it as important. But we need to allow it to grow, and our leadership needs to be there to be inspired. Like I remember Pat when he was a priest. I was inspired that we had one of our own there. I was inspired with Monty. Monty and my father got on very well. They used to sit and have a few conversations together over a lemonade or two, and talk about all different things. I'm inspired every time I go to Port Keats and listen to Boniface because he's able to draw on his culture and also of Christianity and meld the two together and make sense. It makes sense. Any other question? Yes.
Frank, something before about knowledge and we were talking about lack of recognition, and I'm asking myself, what knowledge do we need for ordination? I suppose that as a Christian that is stirred up in me. What's the basis of it? And are we?
That's the whole question of leadership, isn't it? I think it's good that Chris is trying But I think there's a whole question about what is leadership for us? Like in some communities that may be sitting around and saying, well, George, you run it today. You run the liturgy together as a group. Or Henry, over there, you run it. We respect you and you can lead the liturgy for us today. But, you know, there is a lot of debate that goes on about, well, what is priesthood and what is leadership these days in the whole thing. But for us as culturally, we have leaders. We know who those leaders are. They stand out. You've come and met quite a few of them in your life who should be ordained. And as for training of them, yes, we do need to know our roots, like in the sense of where we come from. But we also need to know a lot more about us as Aboriginal people as well. Been to the Holy Land on a few occasions, I tell you, it's an awesome experience. And I would highly recommend it to go to the Holy Land and visit some of the sites, to walk Jesus' country, as I call it, to see where he came from, why he thought like this. Even standing there at Lake Galilee and watching the fish jump of a morning out there on the lake, it's quite an awesome, moving experience to be able to read the country and see the country. We need to do that, but with see those through Aboriginal eyes, not through white anthropologists, not through white theologians. There has been quite a lot that's been written recently from India and Africa of cultural stuff. But one of our big problems, as we'll reveal as months go by at the moment, one thing that we've come to the conclusion about is that quite often it's white people deciding about our lives instead of allowing it to grow and blossom within ourselves as a group about what is leisure. Last question.
Not exactly a question,
Yeah.
a comment. I think, like you mentioned, Burke and Wills who died of hunger when they were surrounded by food because they didn't know the world around them. Maybe it was something similar is happening to Western.
Well, if you think about it, in those days, of course, you don't see us as human beings. Like in the early days, we weren't seen as humans. So therefore, everything that we did was not right, because the Western culture was the only right way of doing things. Right? But the problem is, we did know, and we do have experience that is legitimate and needs to be listened to, spoken about, grown, to allow people to. Because our culture, like I said, we laugh sometimes at some of the things that you guys do. You're so backward in a lot of areas of things, and we just sit there and laugh at you. We wouldn't do it to your face, we're a bit more polite, but we do, like there and now. All right, thanks. Thanks.